I'm LV Brand, 35 years old. Tonight, in the grand foyer of the Kennedy Center, where crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations, my father, Alistair, made me his sacrificial lamb. He placed a proprietary hand on my stepbrother Julian's shoulder, his voice echoing in the marbled space as he addressed a U.S. Senator and the CEO of Northrop Grumman. Julian just accepted an offer from a Wall Street hedge fund. He's going to create real value, he announced, his chest swelling with pride. Then his eyes found me, his tone shifting to one of dismissive amusement. "And this," he said, flicking his chin in my direction, "is Elvie. She chases ghosts on your tax dollars. A romantic but ultimately useless career, hiding in the shadows." The polite, refined laughter that followed was quiet, but it was sharp enough to cut. It was a clean, surgical strike against my soul, executed in front of Washington's most powerful people. In that moment, I wasn't his daughter. I was a public sacrifice on the altar of his ambition. If you've ever felt the sting of being belittled by your own family, press the like button. And if you know what it's like to be the one who never gets the credit you deserve, comment the single word, "me," below. I want to know I'm not alone. I kept my smile perfectly in place. It was a skill I'd honed not in boardrooms, but in the back alleys of the world's most dangerous cities. It was a mask forged in fire. I have held this same smile while staring down the barrel of a gun in Damascus. I've worn it while negotiating with drug lords in Bogota, the air so thick with tension you could taste it. But no amount of training, no amount of hardship could have prepared me for the unique agony of being disarmed so completely by my own father's words. It was a clean, painless kill, executed with the surgical precision of a master. My stepmother, Catherine, glided past me, a phantom in Chanel. She leaned in, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for me. "At least try to be useful and fetch your father another scotch, Elvie. Don't just stand there like a statue." The words were coated in a syrupy sweetness that failed to mask their true meaning. To her, my very presence was an inconvenience, a bothersome relic from Alistair's previous marriage. I wasn't a decorated intelligence officer. I was just a disappointment. A spare part that didn't fit into the perfect family portrait they were so desperate to paint. In their world of glittering galas and political maneuvering, my life was a footnote written in invisible ink. And in that instant, standing amidst the marble and the mockery, I made a silent vow. My usefulness would be demonstrated in a way they could never, ever comprehend. The pain didn't linger. It couldn't. The only easy day was yesterday. The mantra, borrowed from the SEALs, echoed in my mind. The emotional wound cauterized instantly, the pain transmuting into something else entirely. A razor-sharp, diamond-hard focus. I brushed their words aside like dust from my shoulder. My training took over, my instincts fired. My eyes began to scan the crowd, no longer as a spurned daughter, but as an officer on the hunt. My perception of the room shifted. The gentle hum of conversation became a complex soundscape of potential threats. The elegant dance of guests became a series of intersecting trajectories and sightlines. I wasn't seeing people anymore. I was seeing assets, liabilities, and anomalies. I analyzed posture, hand gestures, the subtle tells that screamed what the mouth wouldn't say. And then, I saw it, an anomaly. I locked on. His name was Silas Thorne, known in the intelligence community only as the Ghost. He stood near the main bar, looking perfectly at ease, holding a glass of sparkling water with a lime. It was a flawless piece of cover for an operative who never drank on the job. His file was a ghost story whispered in classified briefings, a master of colorless, odorless toxins delivered by the slightest touch. He wasn't here for a firefight. He was an artist, and his medium was assassination so subtle it looked like natural causes. A handshake, a brushed shoulder, a single tainted drop in a target's glass. The question wasn't if, but who. My gaze followed Thorne's line of sight, a laser beam cutting through the glittering crowd. The beam landed on Robert Kincaid, the Director of National Intelligence, my mentor. The closest thing I ever had to a father who saw my worth. He was holding a glass of what looked like champagne, laughing with the same senator my father had been entertaining, preparing for a toast. My heart didn't race. It turned to ice. My body went cold with a chilling, professional certainty. There was no time for alerts through official channels, no time for a security detail to react. It was happening now, in seconds. I slipped my hand into my clutch and pulled out a burner phone. A simple, encrypted device my father would have scoffed at as cheap and insignificant. My thumbs moved with an economy of motion that belied the stakes. The message was 3 lines. It took me less than 3 seconds to type and send. Nightingale Protocol. Compromised beverage. Evacuate. Now. Nightingale. It was the call sign Kincaid himself had given me after a particularly nasty mission in Vienna. It wasn't just a name, it was a pact. It signified an imminent, lethal threat and carried the weight of absolute, unquestionable trust. Across the vast foyer, I saw Kincaid's conversation falter. He casually glanced at his personal phone, his expression unchanging. Then his eyes lifted, sweeping the room until they found mine. I gave him the slightest, almost imperceptible shake of my head. That was all it took. He understood instantly. Without a word of apology, he placed his untouched champagne flute on a passing waiter's tray. "Gentlemen, you'll have to excuse me," I could almost hear him say, his voice calm and authoritative. He turned and walked briskly toward the exit, his security detail falling into step around him, their professional calm masking a sudden, sharp alarm. My father watched him go, the blood draining from his face only to be replaced by a dark, rising tide of fury. His jaw clenched and a vein pulsed in his temple. He had just lost a priceless moment of access, a connection he had likely spent months cultivating. He turned his glare on me, a look of pure contempt. He had no idea. He couldn't possibly know that his useless daughter, the quiet desk jockey who chased ghosts, had just saved the entire U.S. intelligence community from a catastrophic crisis right under his nose. He had tried to make me a sacrifice, but he was the one who was truly blind. The wail of sirens from a fleet of black FBI SUVs tore through the 6 a.m. tranquility of Georgetown. The sound was an invasive predator in a neighborhood of manicured brick townhouses and quiet old money. My actions the night before had set in motion an unstoppable machine, and now that machine was at my father's front door. From a discreet distance down the street, I watched it unfold. I saw Alistair Brand, my father, standing in his doorway wearing silk pajamas, his silver hair disheveled. For the first time in his life, he looked utterly bewildered, a king stripped of his crown as federal agents flooded into his mansion. All the power he had so carefully built with money and connections shattered against the unyielding force of the law. He was just a man in a bathrobe, helpless. And the piercing sound of those sirens, a sound of consequence and reckoning, dragged me back to another morning. Another shrill alarm that had signaled the end of a world. The morning I lost my only ally. The morning my mother died. Kincaid believed me last night. He trusted my judgment without a moment's hesitation. But my father? He never had. Not once. Only my mother, Eleanor, had ever truly believed in me. Her death was swift and merciless, a brain aneurysm that stole her from the world between one heartbeat and the next. At the funeral, held in a stuffy, oak-paneled room that smelled of lilies and grief, my father stood at the pulpit and delivered a eulogy. He spoke of her achievements, but only as they related to him. He praised her as the perfect hostess, an elegant partner, a steadfast supporter of his ambitions. He never once spoke of the woman herself, the philosopher who read Kant for pleasure, the historian who could lose herself for hours in the archives of the Library of Congress, the gentle soul who saw strength not in noise, but in quiet conviction. He eulogized the wife of a successful man, not the woman I called Mom. He buried a reflection of himself, not the person she was. Just 6 months later, Catherine moved in. And with her came the systematic erasure of my mother's existence. Her first order of business was to redecorate. The warm, impressionist landscapes my mother had loved were replaced by cold, severe pieces of abstract art. Her library, a sanctuary filled with the scent of old paper and leather-bound philosophy, was gutted. The bookshelves were torn out to make way for a media room, dominated by a television the size of a small car. Catherine explained it to me with a voice dripping with false sympathy. "We need to freshen up the space, LV darling. Too much of the past just holds us back, don't you think?" She wasn't freshening up a space. She was methodically scrubbing my mother's soul from the very walls of her own home, turning me into a ghost in the house I grew up in. But the final unbearable blow came on a crisp autumn afternoon. I came home from a training exercise at Quantico to find landscapers digging up my mother's rose garden. It wasn't just a garden, it was her sanctuary. It was where she had taught me that the most beautiful roses often had the sharpest thorns, a lesson about resilience and hidden strength. It was the last piece of her that was truly alive. Catherine stood on the patio, directing the workmen with a pointed finger, a blueprint clutched in her hand. She explained without even bothering to look at me that she needed the space for a tennis court. "Your father needs to get more exercise," she said, as if discussing the weather. Something inside me snapped. For the first and only time in that house, I screamed. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure agony. I ran to my father, my voice shaking with a rage I didn't know I possessed. "How could you let her do this?" He looked at me, his eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. "Eleanor is gone, Elvie," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "We have to move on. Don't be so sentimental." In that moment, I understood. He wasn't just burying his wife, he was burying my memory of her. He was burying the very idea that we had once been a family. The man who stood before me was a stranger, and his house was no longer my home. That act of erasure, that final desecration, was what pushed me toward the CIA. If there was no place for me in my father's world of tangible assets and calculated returns, then I would find a world of my own. A world of shadows, yes, but a world where loyalty was currency and conviction was everything. I applied in secret. The day the official acceptance letter arrived, thick and heavy with my future, I didn't go home. I drove to my mother's grave. I laid the letter on the cold marble headstone, the name Eleanor Brand etched beneath my fingertips. I whispered my promise to the silent stone, to the memory of the only person who ever understood. "I'm going to live a life of purpose, Mom. A life where strength isn't measured by things that can be taken away." My father saw my choice as the ultimate betrayal. When I finally told him, he erupted. He roared that I was throwing my future away, that I was too weak, too soft to compete in his world. He said I was running away. But he was wrong. I wasn't running away. I was running toward something. I wasn't weak. I was simply choosing a different kind of strength, a quiet, resilient, and enduring strength. The kind he could never see and would never, ever understand. The kind my mother had planted in me, in a garden that now only existed in my memory. 2 days after the raid, I met Kincaid at a CIA safe house in Falls Church, Virginia. From the outside, it was the picture of American suburbia. A tidy colonial with a white picket fence and a perfectly manicured lawn. It was utterly anonymous, blending seamlessly into a neighborhood where the most exciting event was the weekly trash pickup. It was the perfect place to hide in plain sight. Kincaid was waiting for me in the sparsely furnished living room. He didn't offer a handshake or a formal greeting. He simply handed me a steaming mug of black coffee. The gesture was simple, direct, and spoke volumes more than any official commendation could have. At my father's party, I was the help, sent to fetch a drink. Here, the Director of National Intelligence served me coffee. "You saved my life, LV," he said, his voice low and even. There was no flowery praise, no grand declaration, just a quiet, factual acknowledgement between two professionals. In our world, that was the highest form of respect. He took a sip from his own mug before continuing. "We're going through Thorne's burner phone data now. There's something that doesn't add up." He looked at me, his eyes sharp with analytical detachment. "Your father, he doesn't fit the profile of a mastermind. He feels more like a puppet." The words weren't meant as a comfort. They were a cold intelligence assessment. A puppet. The term hung in the air, foreign and wrong when applied to a man like Alistair Brand, a man who prided himself on being the one pulling the strings. Kincaid's assessment didn't ease my pain. but it planted a seed of doubt, a question mark in a narrative I thought I already understood. Down in the basement, which had been converted into a temporary command center, my team was already at war. The air was thick with the low hum of servers and the scent of stale coffee. This was my real world. Marcus, our data analyst, was a wizard who could pull a digital needle from a global haystack. He and I had once tracked a Russian sleeper cell across Berlin using nothing but metadata from food delivery apps. Across from him sat Sarah, our linguist, who could seamlessly switch between 7 languages, her mind a living cipher key. No one asked me about my father. No one looked at me with pity. Their focus was absolute, their energy directed entirely at the mission. The drama of my personal life was just noise outside these walls. Here, the only thing that mattered was the work. As I walked in, Marcus didn't miss a beat. He just looked up from his triple monitor setup, his eyes tired but sharp. We traced the initial encrypted calls from Thorn, led us to a shell corporation tied to a bank in Cyprus, he said by way of greeting. Welcome back, Nightingale. That was it. No condolences, no awkward questions, just a battlefield update and my call sign. In this room, I wasn't Alistair Brand's daughter. I was Nightingale. I was an asset, a teammate, a part of something larger than any family name. This basement, with its flickering screens and whiteboard scribbles, was more of a home than my father's marble mansion had ever been. This was my family, a family forged not by blood but by shared risk, mutual respect, and absolute trust. That evening, dinner was pizza from a local joint, eaten out of cardboard boxes on the floor. We sat surrounded by laptops and classified files, the glow of the screens illuminating our faces. Kincaid had stayed, sitting cross-legged on the floor with us, a slice of pepperoni pizza in his hand. He shared stories from his early days at the agency, back when Langley was still surrounded by farmland. He spoke of mistakes made, lessons learned, and the brutal realities of the job. Then he turned his gaze to me, his expression serious. Alistair might teach his son how to make money, Elvie, but he can never teach him what you have, and that's trust. He gestured around the room at Marcus and Sarah, who were arguing amiably about a line of code. In our world, it's the only currency that matters. It's the only thing that's real. People will follow orders, but they'll only die for someone they trust. His words, spoken amidst the smell of melted cheese and the quiet clatter of keyboards, felt like a validation of my entire life's trajectory. It was the affirmation I had spent years searching for in my father's cold, dismissive eyes. It confirmed that the lonely, silent path I had chosen was the right one. Before he left, Kincaid pulled me aside near the door. He placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. I know this is personal, he said, his voice dropping. But the country needs you focused. We need to find who was behind Thorn. As for your father, let the justice system do its work. Your job is to protect the bigger picture. It wasn't an order. It was a sign of respect. It was his way of acknowledging the impossible weight I was carrying while reminding me of the duty we shared. I understand, sir, I said, my voice steady. I watched from the doorway as his black sedan disappeared into the quiet suburban night. The world my father had built was crumbling, its foundations of wealth and influence proving to be nothing but sand. But my world, this world of shadows and secrets, was solid. It was built on the bedrock of these people, the allies who believed in me, not because of the name I carried, but because of the work I did. And it would not fall. The data from the bank in Cyprus was like pulling a single loose thread on an exquisitely woven tapestry. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then, with a slow, sickening certainty, the entire fabric of my father's life began to unravel. Marcus had been mainlining coffee for 48 hours straight, his obsession a palpable force in our subterranean command center. He chased the money through a labyrinth of shell corporations and shadowy holding companies, a digital bloodhound on a scent that snaked from the Caribbean to Eastern Europe. It's a masterclass in money laundering, he muttered, more to himself than to me. Classic Russian nesting doll structure. Every time you open one shell company, there are 3 more inside. He navigated the complex web with a grudging respect for its architect, and finally, after peeling back the last layer, he found it. The end of the trail. The transactions laundered through a dozen different entities all converged on a single, chilling name: Dmitry Volkov. Volkov was more of a legend than a man, a Russian oligarch with deep ties to both the Kremlin and the international underworld. He was an arms dealer the CIA had been trying to pin down for years, a ghost who moved billions in illicit funds with untouchable ease. The name alone sent a chill through the room, silencing the low hum of the servers. Marcus swiveled in his chair, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. He pointed a trembling finger at a complex flowchart on his screen that looked like a madman's spiderweb. "This is the part you're not going to believe," he said, his voice raspy with exhaustion. "Your father isn't taking money from Volkov." He zoomed in on a series of outgoing transfers, their frequency like a frantic, rhythmic pulse. "He's been paying him massive amounts consistently for the last 10 years. Alistair Brand isn't the client, LV, he's the debtor." Suddenly, the pieces of a puzzle I never knew existed began to click into place. The picture they formed was brutal and clear. 10 years ago, in the smoldering ruins of the 2008 financial crisis, a high-risk investment my father had championed went spectacularly bad. It was a failure he had buried deep, a secret kept from the financial press and even his own family. It had pushed him to the absolute brink of bankruptcy, threatening to destroy the empire he had spent a lifetime building. And then Volkov had appeared, a savior emerging from the shadows. He had offered Alistair an enormous sum of money, a lifeline to salvage his reputation and his company. But it wasn't a loan with interest rates and repayment schedules. It was a leash. It was ownership. In exchange for the bailout, Alistair became Volkov's personal banker in the West. For a decade, he had been forced to launder money, using his legitimate financial networks to sanitize the blood-soaked profits from Volkov's global arms deals. My father, the man who preached about strength and control, the titan of venture capital who measured a man's worth by his net income, was nothing more than a well-paid slave. The master of his universe was, in fact, a pawn in a much deadlier game. The agency's core lesson hammered into my brain: assume nothing, question everything. I had assumed my father's cruelty was a product of his arrogance, but now I had to question that. Was it arrogance, or was it the desperate posturing of a man terrified of being exposed? Later that day, Sarah called me over to her station. "You need to see this," she said quietly. On her screen was a surveillance photograph forwarded from the Swiss Federal Intelligence Service. The image was crisp, taken from a distance but with a powerful lens. It showed two men sitting at a lakeside cafe in Geneva, the pristine waters of Lake Geneva sparkling behind them. The photo was dated just 3 weeks before the gala at the Kennedy Center. One man was Silas Thorne. The other was my father. My breath caught in my throat, but it was the look on my father's face that told the real story. This wasn't a powerful man giving an order. He looked diminished. His shoulders were slumped, his posture defeated. The lines on his face, which I had always interpreted as marks of authority, now looked like cracks in a crumbling facade. He looked old, tired, and consumed by something I had never seen on him before: fear. Thorne, by contrast, was the picture of relaxation, leaning back in his chair with a slight, predatory smile. He looked like a cat toying with a cornered mouse just before the final, fatal pounce. That was the moment any vestige of satisfaction I might have felt died. The righteous anger, the cold desire for justice, it all evaporated, replaced by a hollow, chilling emptiness. My father had set the stage for Kincaid's assassination, yes, but he wasn't the playwright. He was just an actor, reading lines that had been handed to him at gunpoint. Kincaid summoned me to his office at Langley later that evening. The room was dark, save for a single lamp on his desk that cast long shadows on the walls. He got straight to the point. "We believe Volkov was coercing your father," he said, his voice grim. The final demand was for Alistair to use his social access to get Thorne into that party. It was a test of loyalty, a final, impossible task. If he refused, Volkov wouldn't just have ruined him financially. It would have been worse. It's likely he threatened Catherine or Julian. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet room. He steepled his fingers, his eyes boring into mine. Then he delivered the final, devastating blow. Or you, Elvie. The sentence hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. Suddenly the scene at the Kennedy Center replayed in my mind, but through a new, distorted lens. My father's public humiliation of me, his cruel, dismissive words, a romantic but ultimately useless career, hiding in the shadows. Was it all part of the performance? A desperate, twisted attempt to push me away, to sever ties so publicly that Volkov would see me as insignificant, not a threat or a target in the dangerous world he'd been dragged into? Was it an act of protection disguised as an act of cruelty? For the first time, my father's actions were no longer a simple matter of malice. They had become a painful, impossibly complex question. The man I hated may have been trying to save my life, and in the cold, brutal calculus of espionage and survival, I had to consider a truth I never wanted to face. The greatest monster in my life might also have been a victim. The FBI visitation room was aggressively sterile. Stark, white walls, fluorescent lights that hummed with an unnerving buzz, and no windows. Nothing but a single metal table and 2 chairs bolted to the concrete floor, as if they expected a hurricane. The room was designed to strip a person of all comfort, all sense of self. It was the complete antithesis of the world my father had built for himself, a world of mahogany desks, plush leather, and expansive views of the city. The heavy steel door clanged open, and a guard led my father in. The Alistair Brand who entered was a man I didn't recognize. The impeccably tailored suits were gone, replaced by a baggy, garish orange jumpsuit that hung off his diminished frame. His skin had a grayish pallor, and the fire in his eyes had been extinguished, leaving behind only dull, tired embers. For the first time in my life, he wasn't a titan. He was just an old, broken man. He shuffled to the table and sat, never once meeting my gaze. His eyes were fixed on the polished surface of the metal, as if it held the answers to a life gone wrong. The guard locked his handcuffs to a bolt on the table, and the sharp, metallic click-clack was the only sound in the suffocating silence. It was the sound of captivity, both physical and spiritual. I sat down opposite him. I didn't say a word. I simply reached into my folder and slid a single photograph across the table, placing it directly in his line of sight. The picture from Geneva. My father and Silas Thorne at the Lakeside Cafe. In interrogation, silence is a weapon. You let it hang in the air, heavy and dense, until the subject can no longer bear its weight. They will rush to fill the void, and often they will fill it with the truth. I let the silence do its work. I watched the seconds tick by, each one a drop of water on a stone. He stared at the picture, his jaw working silently. His facade, even in this diminished state, was trying to hold, but the cracks were showing. Finally, he broke. "What do you want, Elvie?" His voice was a dry, ragged whisper, a sound I had never heard from him before. I ignored his question. It was a plea for terms, a negotiation. I wasn't here to negotiate. I was here for the truth. "How much did you owe Dmitry Volkov?" I asked. My voice was calm, level, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice I used with assets in the field, a tool to convey control. He flinched as if I had struck him. His head snapped up, and his eyes, wide with shock and a flicker of raw fear, finally met mine. In that moment, he realized this wasn't a family visit. This was an intelligence debrief, and I held all the cards. He understood that I knew far more than he could have ever imagined. I didn't give him time to recover. I pressed on, my voice maintaining its steady, dispassionate cadence. "He threatened Catherine and Julian, didn't he? Is that why you agreed to get Thorne into the gala?" Each question was a surgical incision, precisely targeted to bypass his pride and cut straight to the festering wound of his fear. I wasn't accusing him of being a monster. I was exposing him as prey. "You don't understand," he stammered, his cuffed hand coming up to rub his forehead, a gesture of profound weariness. "It's a different world. Different rules." "No," I cut him off, my voice turning to ice. The rules are always the same, Father. There are the strong, and there are the weak. You taught me that. It's the first and only lesson you ever drove home. I leaned forward slightly, my eyes locking onto his. So why did you let a man like Volkov turn you into his puppet? That question hit him like a physical blow. It struck at the very core of his identity, the bedrock of the philosophy he had preached his entire life. The world, according to Alistair Brand, was a brutal food chain, and he was always at the top. To be called a puppet was to invalidate his entire existence. He broke completely. His head fell forward, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. All the arrogance, all the bluster, all the carefully cultivated power dissolved into the pathetic trembling of a defeated man. Because he could take everything, he whispered, his voice broken and choked with shame. Everything I built, all of it. And I was too old, Elvie. Too old to start over. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. It was the confession of a man whose pride had finally been devoured by his fear. I stood up to leave. The triumphant satisfaction I had once fantasized about was nowhere to be found. There was no victory here, only a bitter, empty ache in the center of my chest. I walked to the door and paused, my hand on the handle. I turned back to look at him one last time, his head still bowed in shame. Everything you said to me that night, I asked, my voice quiet but clear in the sterile room. At the Kennedy Center, when you humiliated me, were you trying to push me away to protect me? Or is that really how you see me? I didn't wait for an answer. I let the question hang in the air between us, a final sharp blade left twisting in his conscience. A guard unlocked the door, and as the heavy steel swung shut behind me with a final, definitive clang, I knew. His answer wouldn't come in words. It would come in his actions, in the choices he made when he stood before a judge. The choice was now his, and his alone. To remain a coward, hiding behind circumstance, or for the first time in a very long time, to do the right thing. The courtroom at the E. Barrett Prettyman U.S. Courthouse was a theater of justice, and it was packed to the rafters for the season's most anticipated drama. Every polished oak bench was filled with reporters, their pens poised like vultures, and the curious, powerful faces of Washington's elite, who had come to witness the public dissection of a king. It was the hottest ticket in town, a spectacle of downfall that was far more compelling than any gala at the Kennedy Center. In the front row, a tableau of a broken family, Catherine and Julian sat stiffly, their faces pale and drawn. They looked less like a supportive family and more like actors in the final, tragic scene of a play they hadn't rehearsed. Their carefully curated world of social standing and inherited prestige was burning down around them, and they were paralyzed in the smoke, watching their future turn to ash. When my name was called to the stand, a palpable hush fell over the room. The low murmur of speculation ceased, replaced by an intense, collective focus. The walk from my seat to the witness stand felt 1,000 miles long, every footstep echoing on the marble floor, each one amplified in the cavernous space. I took the oath, my hand steady on the Bible, my voice clear and unwavering, and sat. I presented the facts of the case with the same dispassionate clarity I would use in a classified briefing at Langley. My voice was a monotone instrument of fact, detailing timelines, explaining evidence flows, and answering every question from the assistant U.S. attorney with precision and professionalism. I did not look at my father. I built a wall in my mind and refused to let my gaze drift toward the defendant's table. To look at him would be to allow the daughter to surface, and she, with all her pain and complicated history, had no place here. In this room, under oath, I was not Elvie Brand, the daughter. I was a senior field officer for the Central Intelligence Agency, a servant of the United States government. My duty was to the truth, a concept that felt cold and hard and absolute. My personal feelings were a liability, and I had them locked down tight. My father's legal team, a high-priced trio from one of D.C.'s most formidable law firms, had prepared a complex and aggressive defense. Their strategy outlined in pretrial motions was clear. Paint Alistair Brand as a victim. a distinguished businessman coerced by the ruthless international criminal Dmitry Volkov. They would argue duress, minimize his culpability, and I knew they would eventually have to try and discredit me. They would paint me as a bitter, estranged daughter with a personal vendetta, using our fractured family history to cast doubt on my testimony. The air in the courtroom crackled with anticipation. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the legal fireworks to begin. But when it was his turn to speak, my father did something no one, least of all his own lawyers, could have ever predicted. As his lead counsel, a man renowned for his brutal cross-examinations, approached the podium, Alistair stood up. He was still in his orange jumpsuit, a stark symbol of his fall from grace, but for the first time in weeks, he stood tall. He held up a hand, a gesture of quiet authority, to silence his stunned attorney and turned to face the judge. In that moment, a flicker of the old Alistair brand, the Titan, the commander, returned, his presence filling the room. "Your Honor," he said, his voice ringing with a clarity and strength that seemed impossible just a day before in that sterile visitation room. "I wish to change my plea." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. A wave of murmurs and whispers rippled from the back benches to the press gallery as reporters frantically scribbled in their notepads. Catherine let out a choked sob, her hand flying to her mouth. Julian stared, his face a mask of utter disbelief. His lawyer, pale and frantic, rushed to his side, whispering urgently, hissing legal warnings. But my father waved him away with a decisive gesture of finality. He looked directly at the judge, his gaze unwavering. "I plead guilty," he repeated, his voice even stronger now, cutting through the rising noise. "Guilty to all charges." He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle, commanding the silence. "On one condition." The prosecutor, equally stunned, rose to his feet, ready to object to any kind of deal, but the judge held up a hand, her eyes fixed on my father, intrigued by this unprecedented turn. "My sole condition," Alistair continued, his voice resonating with a newfound dignity, "is that all my junior employees at Brand Capital, the men and women who executed these transactions on my orders without any knowledge of their illicit nature, are granted full immunity from any investigation or prosecution. They are good people who trusted me. They are innocent. The fault is mine, and mine alone." It was an extraordinary act of self-immolation. For the first time that I could remember, he was not thinking of himself. He wasn't trying to save his skin, his money, or his reputation. In his moment of total defeat, he chose to protect the people who had been loyal to him. He was salvaging not his own legacy, but theirs. He was sacrificing his last chance at a reduced sentence to ensure they would not be dragged down with him. It was an act of leadership, an act of honor performed from the lowest point in his life. As the U.S. Marshals moved in to lead him away, our eyes finally met across the crowded room. And what I saw in his gaze stunned me. There was no arrogance, no defiance, no fear. There was only a profound, weary acceptance, and something else I couldn't quite name. Something that looked almost like peace, like a man who had finally unburdened himself of a weight too heavy to carry. He hadn't tried to use our broken relationship to save himself. He hadn't allowed his lawyers to tear me down on the stand. His final public act was one of quiet, unexpected integrity. And in that silent, fleeting glance, he gave me the answer to the question I had left, hanging in the cold, sterile air of that visitation room. "Were you trying to protect me, or is that really how you see me?" His guilty plea, his selfless condition, was the answer. He had chosen not to be a coward. He had chosen, in the end, to protect the innocent, including me. It wasn't a victory. Watching my father being led away in handcuffs didn't feel like winning. But it was a moment of truth, a flicker of redemption in the ashes of his life. And for the first time, I had to wonder if his definition of strength and my own weren't so different after all. Alistair Brand was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The news exploded across every media platform, transforming my family's private tragedy into a national spectacle. Cable news pundits dissected his fall from grace, and newspapers splashed his haggard courtroom photo across their front pages. The Brand name, once a symbol of power and success, was now synonymous with scandal. From my penthouse apartment in Old Town Alexandria, I watched the Potomac River flow silently by, a calm gray ribbon indifferent to the chaos. There was no feeling of victory, no sense of vindication. There was only a profound, echoing silence. It felt like the aftermath of a long and brutal field operation, that moment when the adrenaline finally drains away, leaving behind nothing but bone-deep exhaustion and the unsettling quiet where the explosions used to be. I had done my duty as an officer of the law, but as a daughter, I felt as though I had just witnessed a part of myself being locked away behind bars. The drama had reached its climax, the curtain had fallen, but the aftershocks were still trembling deep within my soul. The call came 2 weeks later, shattering the fragile peace I had begun to build. It was Catherine. Her voice on the line was stripped of its usual socialite charm. There was no grief, no concern, only the sharp, brittle edge of frantic calculation. "Our lawyer says Alistair's assets are frozen," she said, dispensing with any greeting. Her words were clipped, transactional. "Your mother's inheritance, the trust he set up for you in her name, is likely the only thing the government won't touch. Julian and I need it. We need it to maintain our lives. You have to sign it over to us." I was silent for a long moment, stunned by the sheer, unadulterated audacity. In the entire span of our conversation, she never once asked how I was. She never mentioned the man who had just sacrificed his freedom, in part, to protect her and her son. Her husband was facing over a decade in prison, and her only concern was that the flow of money might be interrupted. Her entire world was collapsing, and she was worried about who would pay for her country club membership. We agreed to meet at a cafe in Georgetown, neutral ground for what felt like a final, bitter negotiation. She arrived looking like a caricature of a grieving widow, clad in a black Chanel suit and oversized sunglasses that hid eyes I doubted had shed a single genuine tear. She sat down, gestured for the waiter, and ordered a Voss water with lemon before turning her attention to me. "Elvie, let's be practical," she began, her tone condescending, as if speaking to a child. "Your father has ruined his life. Don't let him ruin our futures as well." "You mean your and Julian's future," I corrected, my voice unnervingly calm. The years I'd spent facing down threats without flinching were serving me well now. She was just another adversary, albeit a pathetically predictable one. "That money is my mother's," I continued, my voice even and steady. "And it will be used to honor her. I'm putting it all into a new trust fund in her name. The Eleanor Brand Foundation will provide full scholarships for young women from disadvantaged backgrounds who want to pursue careers in law and public service. That will be her true legacy." Catherine's face went white. She slowly pulled off her sunglasses, and for the first time, I saw the raw panic in her eyes. The mask had slipped. "You wouldn't dare," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "After everything this family has done for you, you owe us." The word hung in the air between us. Away. For a lifetime of being treated as an afterthought, a relic, a disappointment. For the constant comparisons, the public humiliation, the erasure of my mother's memory. The debt, I realized with sudden, absolute clarity, was not mine to pay. "I don't owe anyone a thing," I said, and as the words left my lips, I felt a lifetime of doubt and insecurity fall away. For the first time, I truly believed it. My father is paying the price for his choices. Now it's your turn to face the consequences of yours. I pushed my chair back and stood up, looking down at her for the last time. "Don't ever contact me again." I took a $20 bill from my wallet and placed it on the table to cover my untouched coffee. Then I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. As I stepped out of the cafe and into the crisp autumn air, I felt a physical sensation, as if a massive, invisible weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The final, toxic tether that bound me to their world had just been severed. It was a painful amputation, but a necessary one. It was my final and most important act of liberation. Before I go on, I have to ask, have you ever had to make the difficult choice to cut a toxic person out of your life, even if they were family? If you have, press the like button. And if you believe that setting boundaries is an act of self-love, comment "freedom" below. My training had taught me that hesitation in the face of a threat, any threat, could have fatal consequences. I had spent my entire life hesitating with them, always hoping, always giving them one more chance to see me. Now, I finally understood. The threat wasn't a man with a gun or a bomb in a marketplace. It was the slow, insidious poison of a relationship that demanded I be anything other than myself. And the only antidote was to walk away. After cutting the final thread connecting me to Catherine, I felt a strange and profound sense of liberty. It was as if I had been walking against a strong wind my entire life, and had only just realized it when the wind suddenly stopped. The inheritance from my mother, a sum that my father had always viewed as just another number on a balance sheet, and Catherine saw as a lifeline for her lavish lifestyle, now presented itself to me as something else entirely. An opportunity. A purpose. I didn't need the money. My life, lived in the quiet shadows of the intelligence world, was simple. My apartment, my books, and the calming view of the Potomac were all the luxuries I required. But I could make that money mean something. I could transform it from a source of conflict into a wellspring of hope. I spent the next several months in a self-imposed deep dive, working with a team of estate lawyers and financial advisors. It was a different kind of mission, one that required navigating bylaws and tax codes instead of hostile territories. But I approached it with the same focused intensity. I researched, I planned, I built a framework from the ground up. From the ashes of my family's public implosion, something new began to take shape. The Eleanor Brand Foundation. Its mission was simple and direct: to provide full 4-year scholarships to gifted young women from underprivileged backgrounds who wanted to dedicate their lives to public service, in law, diplomacy, and intelligence. Every decision I made felt like an act of defiance against my father's definition of value. He had built an empire of concrete and capital designed to cast a long shadow bearing his name. I would build a legacy for my mother out of something far more resilient: people. I didn't want my mother's legacy to be a cold marble headstone in a manicured cemetery, a name slowly eroded by acid rain. I wanted it to be a living, breathing army of brilliant, powerful women, ready to change the world in ways my father could never comprehend. The official launch of the foundation was held in the Riggs Library at Georgetown University, my mother's alma mater. The space itself felt like a tribute to her. It was a cathedral of knowledge, with soaring cast-iron alcoves and shelves of ancient books stretching toward the heavens, the air thick with the sacred scent of old paper and learning. Sunbeams lanced through the tall arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, brilliant stars. It was a place Eleanor would have loved, a sanctuary where she would have felt completely at home. My chosen family was there. Kincaid attended, not as the director of national intelligence with a security detail in tow, but simply as Robert, a friend in a simple suit who stood quietly at the back. Marcus and Sarah came as well, looking slightly out of place in their formal wear, but grounding me with their quiet, unwavering support. Their presence was a silent testament to the new foundation of my life. As I stood at the podium, I looked out not at a crowd of donors or press, but at the bright, hopeful faces of the first 10 recipients of the Eleanor Brand Scholarship. They were from all over the country: a girl from a Detroit housing project who was the first in her family to go to college, a young woman from a small town in Appalachia who dreamed of becoming a diplomat, another from a Texas border town who spoke 3 languages and wanted to work for the FBI. They were brilliant, ambitious young women who had overcome incredible odds just to be in this room. Seeing the fire in their eyes, I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a feeling that had been absent for far too long. When I spoke, my voice was clear and steady, amplified slightly by the microphone. I didn't talk about myself or the recent scandal. I spoke about my mother. I told them about her boundless love for knowledge, her unshakable belief in the power of educated women, and how she had quietly championed my own unconventional path when no one else understood it. My mother taught me, I said, my gaze sweeping across the young faces before me, that true strength isn't about the noise you make or the buildings you own. It's about the quiet impact you have on the world, an impact measured in the lives you better. She believed that a single, educated woman could be a more powerful force for change than any army. This foundation is her impact. You are all her impact. You are her living legacy. After the ceremony, as I chatted with the students, hearing their stories and their dreams, Kincaid came to my side. He looked around the magnificent library, a gentle smile on his face. "Your mother would be so incredibly proud, Elvie," he said, his voice filled with a genuine warmth. "You've taken something that could have been a burden, a source of pain, and transformed it into a source of strength for so many." Alistair built his power on things that could be seized and frozen. "This," he said, gesturing to the vibrant young women around us, their laughter echoing through the hallowed hall. "This is a kind of power that lasts forever." His words, combined with the presence of my team and the infectious joy of the scholarship winners, worked like a balm on an old wound. They filled a void inside me I didn't even know was still there. In that moment, I saw with absolute clarity how wrong my father had been about everything. A legacy isn't your name on a skyscraper or the number of zeros in your bank account. A legacy is the lives you touch. It's the seeds of hope you plant in soil you may never see bloom. Later that evening, I didn't go straight home. I drove to the Lincoln Memorial and sat on the cool marble steps, looking out at the reflection of the Washington Monument shimmering in the long, dark pool. The city, this nexus of power and ambition and intrigue that had been the backdrop for so much of my pain, looked serene under the vast, starry sky. For years, I had navigated its dark underbelly, fighting shadows in a world my father disdained. But tonight, I felt a different kind of victory. I had faced the ghosts of my past, not with a weapon or a whispered secret, but with truth and, unexpectedly, with compassion. I had forged my own path, not one laid out for me by my father's expectations, but one built brick by brick from the values my mother had instilled in me. Sitting there, watching the city breathe in the quiet darkness, I realized I no longer needed anyone's approval. I had finally given it to myself. A year passed. A year of quiet rebuilding, of finding a new, calmer rhythm in the wake of the storm. The news cycle moved on, as it always does, and the name Bran slowly faded from the headlines. I poured my energy into my work at Langley and the nascent beginnings of the Eleanor Brand Foundation. I had thought that chapter of my life, the one defined by my father, was well and truly closed. Then, the letter arrived. It came to my office at Langley, bypassing the usual channels and landing on my desk with the morning intelligence briefs. It stood out immediately from the pristine government manila envelopes. It was a standard white business envelope, but in the top left corner was a stark, black ink stamp that made my breath catch. Federal Correctional Institution, Cumberland, Maryland. My heart gave a single, hard thump against my ribs. I recognized the handwriting immediately, even though it was shakier, less confident than I remembered. The once powerful, decisive script was now the unsteady scrawl of an old man. It was from my father. We hadn't spoken since the trial. I hadn't visited. I hadn't written. I had needed the distance, the clean break, to heal. I believed that silence was the only language we had left. Now, this letter sat on my desk, a ghost from a past I thought I had buried. I stared at it for a long time, tracing the jagged lines of my name. I could feel the physical weight of it, the weight of a year of unspoken words, of a lifetime of conflict, all contained within that thin paper rectangle. I left it sitting on my desk for the rest of the day, a silent white sentinel. I wasn't sure I was ready to face whatever lay inside. That evening, back in the sanctuary of my apartment, I finally opened it. The silence of my home felt profound as I slit the envelope with a letter opener. The paper inside was cheap, lined stationery, the kind you buy in bulk at any drugstore. It was a world away from the thick, cream-colored, monogrammed letterhead he had used his entire professional life. The letter wasn't long. There were no excuses, no rationalizations, no pleas for forgiveness. It was stripped of all his usual bluster. He wrote that he had read an article about the Eleanor Brand Foundation in a month-old copy of the Washington Post he'd found in the prison library. He wrote that he had spent many sleepless nights on his narrow cot thinking about it, thinking about my mother, and thinking about me. I spent my whole life building an empire of brick and mortar, of numbers on a page, he wrote, his new unsteady hand filling the narrow lines. It all came crashing down in a single night. You, LV, have built something from intangible values, from honor and purpose, and it will last forever. The words were a concession, a surrender of his entire worldview. But it was the final paragraph that made me stop breathing. It was the confession that I never knew I needed to hear. I never understood your kind of strength, the letter continued. The truth is, it frightened me, because I couldn't control it or measure it in dollars and cents. That night at the Kennedy Center, when you saved Kincaid right under my nose without me even knowing, a part of me, a part I didn't want to admit existed, felt relieved. Relieved to know that no matter how spectacularly I failed, you were going to be fine. You were stronger than I ever knew how to be. Stronger than I ever knew how to be. That was it. The final, devastating truth. All those years of dismissiveness, of scorn, of being made to feel inadequate, it hadn't just been about his arrogance, it had been born of his own insecurity. He hadn't looked down on my strength. He had been secretly in awe of it, and he resented it because it was a currency he couldn't mint and a power he couldn't possess. His contempt was a mask for a quiet, deeply buried envy. I read the letter again, and then a third time, letting the words sink into the deepest parts of me. No tears fell. There was no sudden, dramatic release of emotion. Instead, something deep inside my chest, a tight knot of pain and anger that had been there for decades, slowly, gently, began to loosen its grip. It was the feeling of a bone, long broken, finally setting itself right. I felt no compulsion to write back. This letter wasn't the beginning of a dialogue. It was a monologue. It was a conclusion. It was his final report from a war he had lost. In the stark, quiet solitude of his cell, surrounded by the wreckage of his life, he had finally found a measure of understanding. And I, in the world outside, had finally found my peace. I folded the letter carefully along its original creases. I walked over to the small, dark wooden box on my bookshelf where I kept the few precious mementos I had of my mother. A faded photograph, a pressed rose from her garden, a favorite poem she'd copied out by hand. I placed my father's letter inside with them. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. It was something quieter, something more profound. It was acceptance. The past, with all its ghosts and all its pain, had finally found its proper place. It was no longer a weight on my shoulders. It was just a story in a box. The scenery has changed. Gone are the tense briefing rooms of Langley, the gilded banquet halls of D.C., the sterile white walls of a federal courthouse. Today, I am standing in a clearing, surrounded by the dense, whispering forests of Virginia. I am at Camp Peary, better known to the world as the Farm. This is where my journey began all those years ago, a place of grueling tests and sleepless nights where the raw material of a person is forged into an intelligence officer. But today, I am not the nervous trainee, my stomach churning with a mixture of fear and ambition. I am the instructor. Before me stands a new class of young officers, their faces a mixture of eagerness and unconcealed apprehension. They are the future of the agency. Their eyes, sharp and intelligent, follow my every move. I'm here to teach them about tradecraft, the intricate art of espionage. But I'm not just teaching them the mechanics of dead drops and surveillance detection. I'm teaching them the heart of the job, the psychology of trust, the unwavering necessity of integrity, and the brutal reality of making impossible decisions under unimaginable pressure. I am teaching them how to survive, not just in the field, but with their souls intact. Your greatest weapon, I tell them, my voice carrying easily in the crisp morning air, is not the Glock on your hip or the cutting-edge satellite technology at your disposal. Your greatest weapon is your credibility. I let the words sink in, pacing slowly before them. It is your reputation. It is the absolute, unshakable trust that your teammates, your superiors, and most importantly, your assets will place in you. That trust is not given. It is earned. It is built slowly, meticulously, through 1,000 small, unseen acts of integrity. And it can be utterly destroyed by a single lie, a single moment of cowardice. I stop and look at each of them in turn, making sure they understand the weight of my words. Never, ever underestimate its power. It will keep you alive when everything else fails. It will open doors that were sealed shut. It will, on rare and extraordinary occasions, give you the power to change the world. As I speak these words, I realize I'm not just instructing them. I am reciting my own creed, the fundamental truth that I had to learn through fire and pain. I'm reminding myself of the hard-won lesson that has become the very foundation of my life. After the field exercise is over, a young female officer approaches me, her expression hesitant but determined. She's sharp, one of the standouts of the class. "Ma'am, Mrs. Brand," she begins a little nervously. I needed to say something. My name is Anya Sharma. I'm one of the first recipients of the Eleanor Brand Foundation Scholarship. I stop, taken completely by surprise. I look at her, really look at her, and I see it. The same hunger, the same burning desire to serve a cause greater than herself that I saw in my own reflection all those years ago. She is the living, breathing result of a choice I made in a quiet moment of grief and defiance. "It's because of your foundation," she continues, her voice gaining confidence. "Because of your mother, that I'm standing here today. You gave me a chance that I never would have had otherwise, so I wanted to thank you." A genuine smile spreads across my face, warm and effortless. I see the torch being passed. I see the legacy taking root and growing into something strong and beautiful. "Don't thank me," I say, my voice softer now. "Thank my mother. And do the work that would make her proud." That, I think to myself as she walks away, her shoulders a little straighter than before. That is a legacy. Not a name carved on a cold stone building. It is a flame, passed from one generation to the next, burning brighter with each transfer. The story ends here, not with a bang, but with a quiet sense of peace. I am standing alone on the tarmac of the base's airfield, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the concrete. A C-130 transport plane sits waiting, its engines whining as it prepares for a mission to some far-flung corner of the world. I am no longer haunted by my father's shadow. I am no longer searching for approval in the eyes of others. The need for it has been burned out of me, replaced by a quiet, solid core of self-knowledge. I am L.V. Brand. I am Nightingale. I have found my absolution, not through revenge or reconciliation, but through a fierce and unwavering loyalty to the woman I have become. The sky before me is vast and full of challenges, a boundless expanse of possibility. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I feel completely and utterly free to fly.